Good afternoon, Bill. It's good to see you again. And we're now here to talk about the Q4 and full year report for 2025. Looks like we have a lot to cover.
We do, and yeah, good to see you too. And this is there's a lot of data here, a lot of really interesting stories to tell.
All right. For those of you who haven't heard about Paren, so we are a data platform around the EV charging infrastructure. We cover 95% of the ports in the US and in Canada, and we provide real time insights as well as historical data. Well, let's get right into it and talk about what we've learned throughout Q4 and 2025. The first thing that we wanted to talk is about ports deployment. And I think we have something quite surprising or some big numbers that we wanted to share, Bill. Is that right?
We counted, double counted, and even triple counted to make sure that these numbers were as valid as possible. And yeah, that number beat our expectations. I'll say significantly. And if you want to bring it up on the screen,
And the
um,
expectation was 16,700. Is that right?
our back in
Q2.
early Q2, we did an estimate of 16,700 ports deployed. That was based on conversations with CPOs, historical trends, and some things that we were seeing happening in the market. We thought that number was fairly aggressive. And
Right.
uh, and
And
and as we
here,
counted up at the end of the year, we counted 18,041. And that number is inclusive of all the Tesla the chargers out there that are new and or expanded, all of the non-Tesla infrastructure that went in to the ground in 2025. That number represents 30% year over year growth. So 2024 ports deployed versus 2025. Even better than that is a 44% growth quarter over quarter. Q4 of 2025 was by far the biggest quarter ever, and it dwarfed 2024 again by 44%.
yeah, that's a number we are seeing here, Bill. The distribution of the 18,000 ports on the left-hand side, we can clearly see the ramp of charging ports deployment from one quarter to another. Can you maybe walk us through seasonality a little bit about, why do we believe that, Q1, we've talked about that maybe briefly, but, Q1 is usually like a month with a lower number of ports deployed. And you want to explain about, Q1, maybe Q4, why is it that we have such a difference there?
Yeah, there's a sort of a historical seasonality to the deployment when you look at it year over year. And we've seen this consistently for the 3 or 4 years that we've been tracking this. But typically, there's so much deployment in Q4, there's not enough to deploy in Q1. A lot of the development for these starts once the ground unfreezes, at least in the northern and eastern states. And so that would be in the early to mid spring. And then ports are ready to be deployed in Q3 and Q4. Again, given the nature of how things work today. Of course, there are exceptions, but
Right.
what we're seeing is in Q4, um, in addition to rounding out those deployments at the end of the year, is I'm betting there's some incentives in there. There's some CEO pay incentives going on. There is some bonuses, I'm sure, that are being pushed. We saw way too many stations being brought online in the last 2 or 3 weeks of December.
Of December.
We know that there are teams out there that are pushing hard, and we applaud them for that.
Yeah.
And uh, and that's one of the reasons why not only was Q4 the biggest quarter ever, but when you look at the last 2 years and then you break it down month over month, October was the best month. Then November beat October, and then December beat November, and it just continued to be an explosion of new charging stations across the country.
And maybe also like hitting another milestones, but the 18,000 ports that were added in 2025 bring the total of DCFC ports in the US nationwide slightly over 70,000. So here is a big number out there, 70,000 DCFC fast charging stations, charging ports, available in the US. And another interesting finding, Bill, that we reviewed through the analysis of some of the numbers is on the right side of that screen, the ratio of ports per station. Can you tell us, the trend here, especially in between non-Tesla and Tesla networks?
So we know that Tesla deploys large stations, right? 8, 12, 16, 24 is their bread and butter of their deployments. Of course, there are some really large stations that they deploy, but their averages historically have been between 14 and 16 ports deployed for each one of their stations. That is relatively consistent. The big jump we saw is in the non-Tesla deployments, right? And that is I think we would have been closer to our prediction if that 3.8 number, that 3.5 that we had historically seen in the non-Tesla world, if that ports per station number had stayed in that lower range, the number, of course, would have been down. That's not what happened, right? We saw the combination of Iona, Mercedes-Benz, BP Pulse, even to a regional extent, Apple Green and
That's
Electrical
right.
America in some places all installed medium to large stations that brought this number up significantly to 4.5. And then when you combine that all together and you look at some of the other numbers, diving deeper into that, you will see that that's really the push and the reason why we hit this record number with the strong Q4.
It's amazing to see like the ports deployment plus 18,000 reaching 70,000. So when it comes to supply, the supply is definitely out there, and charge point operators are really rolling out a massive number of ports. But let's take a look at demand. And that's another thing, right? If we see like a lot of ports out there, what is going to be the demand like? And I'm sharing one number, and Bill, you can go in and comment on that one.
So we've looked historically at the number of DC fast charging sessions in the US, and it was as recently as 18 months ago, it was trending to 100 million per year, right? And with the explosion of the ports, I believe that that is giving the US EV driver the confidence to take that electric vehicle on longer road trips, the family road trip, the once or twice yearly trip, plus all the rideshare drivers that are incentivized to drive electric and need public infrastructure to charge, plus the increasing number of used EVs that are entering down market. All of that is combining to just significantly increase the number of public fast charging sessions. This number really, when you think about it, is quite phenomenal and only rising. And that's a continued trend.
It is fantastic. 141 million. I mean, when you think about it, it is really like, representing how much people have been relying on the public charging infrastructure. You've mentioned, all the possible reasons for that numbers, I mean, to be that high. There is also like one more, which could be, the people buying EVs right now, they might not have a house with the capacity to have an at-home charging. And so the next cohort of EV buyers might be relying more on the public charging infrastructure. And we'll talk about reliability, like in a few slides from now, but the network seems to be, solid enough to satisfy the demand here. But let's take a look at the distribution of the 141 million throughout the entire year. So when you take a look at this, Bill, walk us through, like the seasonality and the trend is quite clear about, growth here. But what do you see?
Yeah, and there is seasonality, and you can clearly see here July and August, the typical US travel months, is where historically we see the consistency over an 8-week period of needing effectively peak demand. But then you look at the 4 to 5 week period around Thanksgiving through the end of the year, and you see here December is effectively a new peak. And that was that was a bit surprising to me. That number would be higher than either of the July or August numbers. But again, I think that there are all the things that we've just said about why is the public use growing, and there is just more of a need for it. People are using their EV as an everyday vehicle, which means on occasion I need to go on long trips to see my family during the holidays, and effectively. The infrastructure is being heavily used. Again, you
Right.
look at earlier in the year and you see not very many people charging, relatively speaking. So there's sort of two things here. There's an implied growth that we've grown steadily year over year in the number of charging sessions, as we talked in the last slide. But there is, increasingly seasonality. And the challenge for the industry then is how do I prepare for that peak optimal need?
Yes, and I think that is the right question here, and we're thinking about, um, is the supply of ports that we have talked about before meeting the demand that we are seeing growing here, and that equilibrium that you are talking about, Bill, is something that we wanted to capture using a new KPI that we haven't shared before, at Paren, but that is session per port, and I'm going to let you like walking us through what we are seeing here. There is an overlay of two charts. The one in the back is actually the volume of session that we've seen before, but there is a line here which is reflecting sessions per port. Can you walk us through what you are seeing, Bill, here?
Yeah, so sessions per port is maybe a new metric for us relaying it out in this report. It's not a new metric for the industry. Large
It
CPOs
is.
have used this metric for quite some time, and it's quite valid in measuring the performance at a regional level, and we're using it here at a national level. And what we've done with the straight lines that go across is create this, as you say, this equilibrium. I call it the Goldilocks zone, right? If the number of sessions per port is too high, the drivers are frustrated. If it's too low for a long period of time, CPOs aren't making any money, potentially equipment falls into disrepair and the infrastructure becomes unmanageable, right? So there is this equilibrium mode that we feel we need to be in. And if you look at the peak on this chart and you see that in July and August, equilibrium wasn't necessarily reached because demand was ahead of supply in July and August, and so much so that it broke through the equilibrium barrier. Now it's interesting to look, and you look at December, and you see that that is the largest month ever recorded for public fast charging sessions, on combined with the largest quarter ever recorded for deploying new ports. Now you see that we're in that equilibrium. We're at the high end of it, but we're in that equilibrium. And it will be interesting to watch this trend move forward into 2026 and to see whether or not, we break through the top end of this
Right.
barrier.
And just to be clear, I mean, this is a national average, and we are seeing a lot of very regional or hyper local, situations where demand is way ahead of supply. Obviously, in large, metropolitan areas, we see demand still being way ahead of supply, leading to wait times for some of the drivers. And in some situation where the infrastructure is just growing, obviously, the infrastructure is ahead of demand. So this is like a national average. We have more and more details on the full report in itself, where you can deep dive into each of the states and into like each of the metropolitan areas as well. But this is something that was, sharing, story at the nationwide level. So that's a very good point here. So we're nearing market equilibrium when it comes to supply and demand. And we had another metric that we wanted to share that could also reflect that equilibrium, and that is utilization rate. So utilization rate, you want to talk to us, Bill, about what we're seeing?
Yeah, and that rate has been relatively stable over the course of 2025, anywhere between in the low to mid 16s, right? And that again is another indicator that tells us that there is a demand out there. Supply is not too exhaustive, that this number is going down, and it's not so sparse that the number is shooting through the roof. Again, this is a national average. When
Right.
you go to local and hyper local, we're seeing a lot of really interesting trends. And I think one of the
Yes.
things that's keeping this number up is the deployment of new stations and the time it takes them to reach level of maturity. And a couple of quick examples there, right? We've seen some of the larger CPOs who are data knowledgeable and data aware, that are using the data available to site locations that can almost immediately hit hit a utilization rate that starts them on a path to earning money on those ports. That's number one. The second thing is we're also seeing some hyper local folks that are using data and their market knowledge as well as some of the maturity in deployment to actually target very specific medium-sized charging stations that have hit. We did a 91-day LinkedIn post, right, on how quickly stations come to 91 after 91 days. These new stations are blowing those metrics away on
Hmm.
average.
Yeah.
And again, it's all data driven, and we're so excited to see that.
Let's take a quick look briefly. We're talking about, national average, and this is a map showing us, what the distribution is like of the utilization rate, this time at the state level. So we are obviously seeing, a few states that are way ahead in terms of utilization and sometimes creating situations where demand is ahead of supply. That's the case in California, in Florida, in some of the northeastern states. You want to talk a little bit more about, what's happening? Are states like catching up? Bill, do you see like specific states just, seeing higher utilizations throughout 2025?
Yeah, when you talk about the deployment of 18,000 ports, they're not all located in California, right? And one of the, again, interesting things that we saw is that there are states like Georgia, Texas, Colorado, Pennsylvania that have their infrastructure has grown, so hasn't their utilization. And again, our data dives into levels even more local than this. And we're not going to go into all of the details here, but you can dive into our report and see what these numbers mean and how they've effectively changed over the course of 2025.
We also wanted to take a quick look at some of the attributes of the charging experience. Pricing is stable, right? Throughout 2025.
Yeah, it's been stable, plus or minus a penny here or there. Again, we have another report another slide in the report that goes really deep on pricing and talks about pricing models and some of the changes that we're seeing here. Whether it's time of use, dynamic, or fixed pricing, it still is not moving very quickly, which is a good thing for EV drivers. And we're seeing the CPOs trying to play with pricing in the off-peak hours in order to better attempt to move some of the demand. But on average, the numbers are staying the same.
Yes, and another takeaway about pricing is that pricing is not something on which charge point operators seems to be betting to eventually gain market share. They are trying dynamic pricing, they are trying off-peak, peak pricing as well. But overall, that remains stable for EV drivers. And it's kind of interesting to see what else is actually shifting. And it's all about the product. It's the charging experience, the charging speed. The location, is also like, obviously critically important here. And there is also reliability. And reliability, we wanted to share with you, some good news here.
Yeah, and as we again look across the country and then look at it at the state level and even at the metro level, reliability is increasing for really two key reasons. Three, if we count maintenance, right? Number one is that all of this new equipment is coming on board, and by its very nature, its first few months slash years are going to, in general, lead to higher reliability. The second is the refresh programs that have been in place across several key nationwide vendors and CPOs who are some cases ripping out and replacing, in other cases just modifying existing stations and bringing them up to par for what the expectations are for today's EV driver. And then the third piece is we are seeing just a really good influx in really good best practices from a maintenance perspective in all aspects of monitoring, handling customer requests, getting trucks out to resolve issues quickly. And again, that's leading to shorter downtime where there is downtime, which is going to raise this number up.
Yeah, fantastic. I mean, we're thrilled. I mean, to see that, and it's good to see that drivers are also experiencing, a more reliable charging infrastructure. So we have like three takeaways for 2025. We've talked about the record-breaking numbers of ports deployed. 18,000 new ports deployed in 2025 with a record deployment in Q4, and the total number of ports in the US now reaching 70,000 for fast charging publicly available. The other thing that we want to take away from 2025 is that demand grew all the way to 141 million charging stations. We've talked about seasonality. but the trend is very clear. Demand is growing. And what it is leading to is that it is leading to a sign of maturity because, Bill has been sharing, some equilibrium when we are looking at the session per port per month. We're also seeing equilibrium when it comes down to the utilization rate. We're seeing maturity or stability on pricing and also on reliability. So these are our takeaways for 2025. And we wanted to leave you with one more slide, which is our industry snapshot. Bill, is there anything else that we have not covered that you would want to point to?
We haven't covered it, but we're not going to divulge it here. So you got to download the report to see our 2026 prediction and taking all the same factors we used in making our 2025 prediction to see if we can do better in 2026. So download the report. I forget what slide number it's on, but we give you our key takeaways for 2026, as well as a couple of things to watch out for that could be variables in this equation.
Thank you very much, Bill. It was great chatting with you about these numbers. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thank you.